All right, so in this lecture, we're going to go over sustainability and ecological footprint. So some questions that we'll answer is, or what is sustainability? So some definitions. What do we need to establish sustainability? What is ecological footprint and how can we use it to address sustainability? And this may sound like a silly question, but do we have enough Earths to sustain ourselves? Okay, so hopefully you've read the Richard Heinberg reading, a little short reading about Introduction to Sustainability. And so a couple things he goes into at the beginning are defining what sustainable means. And this is pretty similar to what we've discussed before, that which can be maintained over time. And he does point out that it's important to consider scale. We should at least be able to maintain for centuries at least. We don't know, 1,000 years from now, it's pretty hard to plan for that, even 100 years at this point. But he says, all right, well, if we want to sort of think about sustainability, how do we establish a sustainable society? Let's think, if you remember from a previous lesson, can we continue to do what we're doing? And he's saying, let's think about at least the next couple 100 years. So that's a good frame of reference. And he also mentions the Iroquois Great Law of Peace, which I think is really a good way to think about. And this is from the Iroquois Indians in the U.S. And their great law of peace was, what is your impact on the next 7 generations? So every action you do, think about its impact on the next 7 generations. So again, it's thinking a couple 100 years down the line. But I think what's nice about this one is it also integrates think about the people, like your children's children's children kind of thing. So that helps frame it out a little bit better. So again, how do we start thinking about sustainability? So Heinberg goes over these 5 axioms. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail. You're welcome to dive into them in a little more detail if you'd like to, but I just want to hit a couple of highlights because these are important themes that we'll address throughout the semester. So the axiom is something that's supposed to be sort of self-evident and fairly broad. So the first axiom for him, an axiom of sustainability, is that any society that continues to use critical resources unsustainably will collapse. Okay. And so again, it's just a way to think about sustainability. How can we establish a sustainable society? And we think, all right, well, if we have a critical resource, if we keep using them unsustainably, we'll probably collapse. Now, there's there's at least one exception, excuse me, and that's a society can avoid collapse by finding replacement resources. So you can think about, a couple 100 years ago when we used whale oil, so actually, fat from whales to light lamps. Okay, that's what we use for oil, and that was replaced by petroleum, so rock oil as they called it. And so we find exceptions, okay? And eventually, if we start running out on oil, running out of oil, then we can start to use electric cars. We can use bioplastics and so forth. And so we can find replacements for what you can consider um, critical resources. But there is a limit to that exception, and that this is important to keep in mind, and that we live in a finite world, and so being that we only have one planet Earth, so the number of possible replacements is also finite. So we can't replace things forever. And you want to think about and we'll think about how we can avoid this scenario as we go throughout the semester. So the second axiom is that population and growth in rates of consumption, resources cannot be sustained. And so this is just a simple chart of population growth through time, and it's projected to continue to grow. Most recent projections, we're looking at like 9 to 10 billion by 2050. We're currently at a little over 7 billion. But this is a theme that we'll hit again, and that is that we cannot grow forever on a finite planet. At some point, population has to stop growing. I mean, it's just a logical conclusion. You can't grow forever. We only have one planet Earth, and we can't keep using more and more resources because we only have one Earth to provide those resources. Okay, and again, throughout the semester, we're going to try to address how do we actually avoid this bad scenario. Another really important axiom that he promotes is that to be sustainable, the use of renewable resources must proceed at a rate that is less than or equal to the rate of natural replenishment. So a lot of the natural resources that we use, you think wood resources, food, think about fish from the oceans, the soil that we use to grow the food, fresh water. So a lot of these resources, let's take trees as an example. So trees, they do regrow, but we can, if we use them too quickly, that we'll start to run out of trees, or we'll reduce the overall amount of trees available. And so that's if we have a renewable resource that isn't effectively infinite, like sunlight, we can't really use too much of. Wind is fine. we can't use too much of those. But if we have a resource that does replenish itself, but not at an infinite rate or an extremely fast rate, we have to be careful that we don't use them faster than they can replenish themselves. And there are some practical ways to avoid this. You can look, and again, we'll look at these in more detail, but something that's called sustainable yield forestry. And that basically means, people that in the timber industry have recognized this, like it's common sense. If we cut down the trees too quickly, we're not going to continue to be in business. And so they've recognized that we need to, in order to sustain, so sustainable being an important term here, to sustain our yield over time, we can't harvest the trees any faster than the rate at which they'll regrow, okay? And so we'll talk about that in more detail later. And another really, really important concept that Heinberg talks about is something called ecological footprint. So ecological footprint is he defines it as the amount of land and water area a human population would hypothetically need to provide the resources required to support itself and absorb its waste. The way to think about it is this. If the ecological footprint is the amount of land and water on planet Earth that you need to support your lifestyle. Now you can calculate it for an individual, a city, a country, the whole planet, okay? So what's really nice about ecological footprint is that it puts a very specific number behind what we actually need to sustain ourselves moving forward. And this is really unique. This concept was created in the 1990s. And if you think about the importance here, we've talked about some ways that we're sustainable, unsustainable, and so forth. And you all probably know things, even, most people would know things like, oh yeah, we should recycle. Maybe I should buy less. Maybe I should drive less. Maybe I should, eat local food, whatever. So there's all these sort of good but kind of fuzzy ways that we can try to be more sustainable, which is all well and good. But what's really nice about an ecological footprint is it gives you a really concrete number. Here's the amount of land and water that you need to support your lifestyle. So I want you to think about the implication. If we could add up all of the ecological footprints of all the people in the world, what would a sustainable ecological footprint be? And if you think about it, we only have one Earth's worth of land and water. And so if we could take all of the ecological footprints of all the people in the world, add them up together, we can only support one planet's worth. We only have one planet of space to support these people. So if we add up everybody's ecological footprint and it's more than one Earth, that means we can't continue to sustainably provide for those people. And so as it turns out, you look at, the number, you don't need to memorize this number, but about 40%, so we're currently at about 40% more than the Earth can sustainably provide. And so the question is, how can we actually use more resources than the Earth has available? And the key here is to remember is that one Earth is the level at which we can sustainably support our population. So we can use one Earth. We can use a little more than the Earth can provide. So what's happening over time is that we're actually reducing the amount of resources available to us. And just to give you a little snapshot of how many Earths, so if the average this is just a snapshot of countries, and it shows you if everybody in the world lived like the average person in these countries, how many planets would we need to survive? And so you look at somewhere that's even considered one of the most sustainable advanced countries in the world, Costa Rica, we would need 1.4 Earths to support everybody if they all lived like the average Costa Rican. Even in Nepal, which this surprises me, but even in Nepal, we'd need almost 2 Earths to support everybody. France, about 2.5. The US, now we're not the highest ecological footprint in the world, but we are one of the highest. So if everybody in the world lived like the average American, we would need 4.1 planets to sustainably support ourselves moving forward. Obviously, this is not sustainable, okay? But then you look at some of the lower income countries in the world. You look at Bangladesh, we need less than, so this is the area of land we'd need if everybody lived like the average Bangladeshi, so we would be fine. India, Uganda, so there's a lot of countries, the lower income countries in the world in general. If we all lived like them, we wouldn't, we'd be okay in terms of natural resources. Now, I'm not saying we should all live like the average Bangladeshi. They have a lot of problems. Poverty is an issue. There's a lot of problems there. But the point is that this is the power of the ecological footprint, is we can say, well, you know, in the US we use a lot of oil and we emit a lot of carbon dioxide, we make a lot of waste, and they don't do so much in Bangladesh, but that's really fuzzy. What's really nice about the ecological footprint, we can say, look, if everybody lived like us, we would need 4 planets. If everybody lived like them, we would need less than 1 planet. So it really helps to put a discrete, easy to understand number, excuse me, behind sustainability. All right, so now I want you to think about this chart. So we have on the y-axis here is the percent of global natural resources left, okay? And this is today, whenever today is, and then in the future. It doesn't actually matter what today in the future exactly is. So what I want you to think about is that by definition, this is where we are today, okay? We start with 100% today. So the question is, if we have an ecological footprint equal to 1, what would our percent of resources look like? Would it go down? Would it be across? Or would it be up? And then if it's greater than 1 and less than 1. So if we have an ecological footprint of 1, our line would look, and I apologize for the freehand drawing here. So if we're at 1, that means we are living sustainably. So that is equal to an ecological footprint of 1. Okay? So that means we're living in such a way that the Earth is not drawing down its resources. So at any point in the future, we have the same amount, right? That same 100% that we had when we started. So if we have an ecological footprint greater than 1, think about how the line would go. So we would be more like, this, right? So if it's greater than 1, that means we're going to be reducing our resources over time. Now the line could slope like this, it could be steep, it could be shallow, it could whatever. The whole point is that if we have ecological footprint greater than 1, we're going to slowly lose our resources, okay? Greater than 1. Now if our ecological footprint is less than 1, that means we can actually, and this is possible, we could actually increase, so ecological footprint less than 1, we could actually increase our stock of resources over time. And again, this is just another way to visualize what ecological footprint means. If we can establish an ecological footprint of 1, that means we can continue to maintain our resources over time. This should really sound a lot like sustainability, because it is. If we have greater than 1, we're going to slowly diminish our resources over time. That by definition is unsustainable to continue. And if we can be less than 1, we actually can increase our stock over time, which is also sustainable. So again, this is just another way to think about how ecological footprint relates to sustainability.